Artsakh region, from Khinzoresk region. People started showing up, and here we have this is Armenian. This piece here is an Iranian patents, actually, from the Patents refugee camp that was sponsored by the Israeli Society. Here is a beautiful silk belt that is from Van Vascular region. Here is another pillow cover, a dowry piece, again from Van Vascular region. Here's another handbag that was woven, actually embroidered by refugee women in Athens, again sponsored by the Mira industries. So we're going to be talking about all these in a little while. So keep in tune and join us. All right? See you soon.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I know.
Early, I went down there and I saw them.
Only you can see. No, okay, see. Amigo.
sono regale. C'è buonissimo perché il coraggio per mutapyanı de regal biliyor bas.
Ortadan da bir inscribed olarak Hayerenno Hayerenno Zavazechun Haykı ve Makoç Hayerı Urakasa Hratch Kozibeyokian Aşağı nereye gitti?
Ne? Aşağıya falan. Live. No, backseat, avrei la vede. You're gonna miss the screen. Você não sei da avrei la vede.
Guys, front. Don't hide on the back. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going. Keep going. Only parents are allowed to sit in front. Guys, forward, let's go.
No, just yes. C'è fosse chiesto. Yes, allora no, again, no, no. Yes, yes, yes. Guest. Araçın lettera capitale. Io voto la guest non è capitale. A festo tutti mi alzano, quindi mi alzano. Hocam bir de bekle. No, abbiamo un raggio delante questo su. Posso? A varie di così. Okay. Mit koy gete honte ne sare lab kameran den from the camera hose. Kamera hose herhalde. Honte okay. Gete honte ne sare lab ne. Why don't you talk from there? No. Oh. Well, we can't do it. Okay. Okay, bye. Okay, he's going to fix it. Well, then why am I getting copies? I have some. Thank you. Just a little bit background about our speaker, Hratch Kozibeyokian. the owner of Cozy Craft, is a third-generation master weaver with more than 40 years of hands-on experience. Los Angeles Times has said, woven in time, a valley artisan applies ancient techniques to the ripe and facts in treasured rugs. I have to say that Hratch has been instrumental in helping me with the museum, especially to evaluate some of the rugs that we have, especially with the orphan rugs. He's also evaluated the White House rug that was in Washington, gifted by the orphans. So he's going to be giving us a presentation about Armenian weaving. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you. I always love to visit here and talk. Have seen all these beautiful ancient artifacts downstairs. Yeah? Yeah. Well, that's our heritage. Okay. Let's start. The title of today's event is the Armenian weaving tradition from Neolithic time until modern days, until up to date. The last glacial maximum was about 18,000 years old. So our civilization basically is about that time, 15, 16,000 year old. Prior to that, we had other civilizations, but we're going to be talking about the current one. When the last time the earth was, the snow was melting, the ice age was melting, the very first place that started warming up was what is known Mesopotamia. It's a Greek word meaning between two rivers, Mesopotamia. So all that land between those two rivers that actually started pouring what is known today was the Armenian highlands. Those two rivers start flowing from there, went all the way down to what today we know as Iraq, and poured to the Mediterranean Sea, and it flowed. So in modern days, actually the past 100 years, Armenia was also referred to as South Caucasus or Asia Minor. Well, that nomenclature is actually as a political move, political strategy for the past 100 years or so, from the Soviet time, from the Soviets, also from the Turkish side, from those both sides, to eliminate the name Armenian highlands from the maps. But historically, as you see in this map, Armenian highlands is completely different than the Caucasus. In between Armenian highlands and Caucasus lays what today we know as Azerbaijan. So whenever you see, wherever you read the term South Caucasus, what they mean is Armenia or historic Armenia. And since that was the place where the first river started pouring and the Fertile Crescent started coming to life, that's where the first animals started appearing. That's where the first agrarian society started coming to life. And that's where the first animal domestication happened. So we can assume from that that people, when they came out of the caves, from hunter-gatherers, when they became settlements, that's when they didn't need to travel to distant places to gather their fruits or to hunt. They had the animals, they had their gardens. That's where the first wheat started growing, started being harvested right there. As you see again, the first animal domestication we see here was right on the little south part of the Armenian highlands where those two rivers started flowing. From those from those animals, the first animal that was domesticated was the Armenian sheep, Armenian ram. Until today, the scientific name of this beautiful lamb, beautiful ram, is called Melini armeniaca. And today there are over 3,000 different species, different breeds actually, of sheep family, and they all are derived from this specific breed. That's where also the first invention of the wheel has happened. Now, when the settlement started growing, they had to travel to distant places. So by inventing the wheel and utilizing the animal power, they were able to travel to distant places, to find new farming lands, to find new fields, new pastures for their animals to graze. And that's where actually our civilization, the last civilization, started. Now, you all have heard the term cradle of civilization. When they say cradle of civilization, that's exactly what they mean. And not recently, I'm sure you all heard about the Areni cave, the findings of the oldest shoe that was found not too long ago in Areni cave. But much before that, prior to this excavation in the Areni cave, about 6 years ago, there was another excavation in Arctic field where they have found carbonated, actually this piece of cloth, piece of weaving was found in a cave that wasn't burned, that was turned into a carbon. Now, if it was left as a fiber, it was going to get deteriorated. But it didn't. It was baked like a coal, like a carbon, and it was covered by dirt. That's how it was survived. And in this piece, which is about 2,000 years older than the oldest shoe, so this is about 7,000 years old piece of cloth that was found also in Armenia. Now, by looking at this, we don't only see the weaving pattern. The weaving pattern is identical to a basket weave, let's say, okay? Just a simple weaving. But they also managed to put some patterns here. And in these patterns, there are variations of what we know as swastika. Now, you see this swastika also in Armenian petroglyphs engraved on the stones in Kerama mountains, in Arakaz mountains. We call it Wheel of Eternity because Armenians used this symbol in many, many different forms. We have right rotation, left rotation, 8-winged wheel of eternities, 6-winged ones, 12, 16, 32. They all mean different things. So this is, I would say, is the oldest existing piece of weaving from Armenian highlands. Here is another sample. Little later, we're going to be talking about this specific pattern. Basically, this represents about 8 directions. If we make a cross from vertically one line, horizontally another, and then another X in between, that will represent in many, many Armenian carpets the distance of sun rays. In other words, if we're going to symbolize a sun, we make a cross and then we put an X. That will represent, that symbolizes the sun rays. The worship of sun was the very first belief system among the people that lived in those lands. The oldest existing carpet, what we mean by carpet is when we have a pile, a hand-knotted pile on a basket weave type cloth. A little later, you will see the diagrams of these, the knotting system that Armenians have used that was called the Georgian knot or the Armenian knot. But this sample of the Armenian carpet was found in 1947 in a little village called Pazrek in Siberia by an archaeologist named Kuchenko. It was found in a grave. Now, the reason this carpet was survived in this grave was the grave was flooded with water at one time, soon after the burial has occurred, and it was frozen in a block of ice for about 2,500 years. The carbon date of this carpet pinpoints around 2,500 years before our time, about 500 BC. Recently, there was a study done, some lab tests on the dyes, also on the weaving technique, which is concurrent to the Armenian rug weaving techniques. And the dyes that was used on this carpet was derived from an Armenian insect called Armenian cochineal. We will be talking about the Armenian cochineal also. Here is a detail of the corner of the Pazrek rug. It shows some horsemen, some deer, and also if you look at this symbol here, it is the same thing that we have seen on the archaic piece of cloth, where it represents the sun. If we see a cross, we see clearly, and an X. This represents the sun. On the deer, we see all the internal anatomy of the deer. The horseman, from that time, it is akin to Armenian horsemen at one time when Armenian dignitaries were traveling. They always made a knot on the tail of the horse to signify, to sign that there is a dignitary traveling on this horse. So the people from a distance would know. So those signs, also the dye on this red, derives from the Armenian cochineal that was not found anywhere else in the world. So based on those facts, it is stated that this rug is late Urartian period and early Armenian. We talked about the Georgian or the Armenian knot. As you see, these double knot are the Armenian knot. Later in time, there were other civilizations that did also weave carpets, which they use the single loop, the single knot. This is the Persian or Sena knot, and this is Gordes or the Armenian knot, strictly Armenian. Even in Iran, in Persia, when Armenians weave carpets with Persian pattern or non-Armenian patterns, they also use the Georgian knot. One of the main colors in Armenian culture that has been used is the red. That's not a coincidence. Because when man has, for the first time, started manipulating the gifts of nature to have a pigment derivative from the nature, it was the red color. In the older days, Armenian brides would wear red, not white. The white came later. So this was the correct hue, the correct tone of the red color that the Armenian cochineal came from. The cochineal in a dried form looks like this. They are little larger. The females are a little larger than the ladybug, but the male are much smaller, and the male ones are winged. They mate, they fly, but the female will not fly. They feed on a root of a plant that has a sap that has that red color. So since they feed on that plant only, their body fluids are also the same color. Children, as a field trip, they usually go during the fall to those fields in Armenia to gather and study about those insects. And as you see, there is a small bunch of them in her hand. Usually in late fall, those insects will surface from underground to mate, to lay their eggs, and then they die. That's their life cycle. And people would go and just gather them, dry them, and the dried form is kind of brittle. When they crush it and mix it with vinegar and other mineral salts, they can attain various shades of colors. So this is what it looks like. Here it is. That's the female. You see the color, intense red. Again. Now, the majority, I'm not going to say exclusively, I would say majority, about 98% of Armenian carpets always have this red background. That was the tradition, actually, and because that was the first color that they have attained from the nature. So it's a tradition. The red is the most warm color, the most exciting color. In this 18th century carpet, as you see, this is a classic Armenian rug. You see the background is the same red as the Pazrik rug. There were also other commemorative rugs that was woven by Armenians that had dates and writings on them with also red background. The red background carpets was also used as a wall hanging pieces. As you see on this pattern, it's a directional, it's not symmetric. It goes towards one direction. And if you look at the bottom one and the top one, it continues. That also signifies to eternity. There's no beginning, there's no end. You will see in some of the Armenian rugs are not symmetrical in forms, which we'll see a little later. But it has a continuity, it has a specific direction. And in this pattern, we see the tree of life, actually. That was another symbol, was used among ancient Armenians. Here's another one, commemorative, which we see the date 1909, writing in Armenia, and the name of Shoshana Derkevokian's and other writings. Now, the inscription is not very clear because most of those people the ladies who wove those rugs, they were actually illiterate. They would go to the priest and ask the priest, I want to say this. The priest will write it down. And by the time they come to that part to copy it, sometimes the paper is upside down. The letters, they don't know where to start, where to end. So we see these kind of writings very often. Here's another beautiful piece. This is from northern Armenia, from Lori region. It says Karabakh, but there were some in trade. Many of the names of Armenian rugs are misprinted, and mostly were named by dealers who brought those rugs here to sell it, and sometimes they just gave certain names that had no merit on the real birthplace of the rug. You see many say Karabakh, but it's not Karabakh. Sometimes it's from totally someplace else. Flat weave, also red background. You see sometimes completely blank, nothing else, just a blank single color carpet with just a date on it. Most of those commemorative rugs were woven to donate it to the church. On the older days, the church did not have benches like we have today, these comfortable benches. There was, people would donate carpets. Carpets would go on the floor. You are either standing up or you are kneeling down. So when people would kneel, they would kneel on those carpets, and when they see those names on the carpets, it was for the memory of such and such. That was the reason of those commemorative carpets. But even those, they had those red backgrounds. Now that tradition, the tradition was so popular that outside of Armenia, there were no other cultures that have wove those rugs. And when foreign dignitaries or other kings visited Armenia, Armenian kings would proudly open these rugs and welcome them on those red carpets. And as they were leaving, usually they would receive gifts similar to those carpets. When they went back to their country, let's say, and they would only use that carpet the same manner of which they have seen in Armenia, the way they were approached, they were presented. So they would use it in the same manner. That's became popularized all over the world. Hence, what we know today is the red carpet treatment. That's where that tradition actually started from. We see many illustrations of weaving paraphernalia in Armenian miniature manuscripts, illuminated manuscripts, such as weaving or the spindle. This is an old-fashioned spindle where they would make the thread. First they spin it, and then they double it, and the wool having strong resilience, it would untwist. While untwisting back, it will twist upon itself if there are two plies. That's how it becomes a full thread. So the spindle was used for that purpose. I'm going to take a water. My throat is getting real dry. What we are looking here is one of the first travelers to the East. The handwriting of Marco Polo. He kept a diary, and he wrote all his adventures all the way to China and back. Marco Polo's diary today is still in existence. It's in a museum, and it's called El Milione. That's the direct copy of his handwriting. Ottimo manuscript. It was written in 1309. In his diary, Marco Polo writes the following about the people who lived in those places. He says about the Turkmen nation, he says, Turkmen population consists of three classes. Turkmens, who worship Muhammad and follow his laws, are crude people, he says, completely uneducated. They live in mountains or other virtually inaccessible places which offer good grazing land for their cattle, their sole livelihood. Here, there is an outstanding breed of horses called Turks, and handsome mules which are sold at high prices. So that's the statement about the non-Armenians, let's say, or non-Christians. And then he goes on saying the other Turkmen classes, for him, all these people, right, were just Turkmen, because he couldn't differentiate. He said either there are Christian Turkmens or Islam, non-Christian Turkmens. So he says the other Turkmen classes are made up of Greeks and Armenians, living in the cities in the permanent settlements. That's a key, the permanent settlements. So they're not nomads. They're not. He's differentiating Armenians and Greeks from the Turkmens. Living in cities and permanent settlements and earning their livelihood from commerce and trade. It is here where the best and most beautiful carpets are produced, as well as silk of crimson and splendid colors. Among the most important cities are Konya, Khazar, and Sevastopol, where Saint Blasius attained glorious martyrs crown. They are all subject to the great Khan ruler of Eastern Tatars, blah, blah. So this was the first, I would say the first introduction of Armenian carpets to Europe, to the West. We can assume that. Because in European paintings, we see samples of Armenian carpets post-1300. Prior to that, we At least we don't see anything. If it exists, it can be. But we don't have distinct samples of Armenian carpets prior to Marco Polo. Post Marco Polo, you already know that the pre-Renaissance period started, and during the entire Renaissance period, most of the classic Renaissance paintings do include an Armenian carpet in them. We know of about 300 Renaissance era masterpieces that include Armenian carpets in their subject matter. Now, why would the Renaissance era classic painters include a carpet in their subject matters? Because prior to the paintings of saints, okay, that tradition, in Renaissance era classic paintings, we see all these saints, Madonna and Child, some other saints, and they all have that carpet in them. Well, if we go before the Renaissance era, we go to 8th century, 9th century, 10th, 11th, 12th, up to 14th century, even during Renaissance era, in Armenian illuminated manuscripts, we always find a carpet under the foot of a saint. Whenever you see an Armenian illuminated manuscript, pay attention to the saint. The saint is not on the dirt, on the floor. It is separated from the common. So the carpet also symbolized a throne, a higher space, a different place than the common people. So the same tradition, by studying the Armenian illuminated manuscript, if we go to the Renaissance, basically the idea is the same thing. The carpet is used in the same manner in Renaissance paintings, same as the Armenian illuminated manuscripts. As you see in this painting, a carpet under the foot of the saint, right there. Here is another sample of the Melki Queen. You see she's sitting on the throne, but even the throne, under her foot, you'll see a small carpet. And there are many different, this is from 9th century, and there are many such samples that you can do, you can compare. Here is another Lombardian, Madonna with Child. Again, you see the same similar carpet under her foot. Here are the Renaissance painting. This is the ambassadors of a Dutch painting. Clearly, you can see an Armenian rug. Now, what separates the Armenian rug from, let's say, Persian rug? By just one look, if you look at it, think of Armenian rugs as monumental patterns, right? Abstract, geometric, monumental patterns. You look at the Persian rug. Here are Persian rugs. Ornamental, flora and fauna. You can see, even recognize the flowers in them, whether it's the carnation, a rose. You can see it. There's nothing abstract about it. And then there is in between, which are the nomadic carpets. Now, the nomadic carpets, nomads travel from one place to another. Hence, they come across to many different cultures. So they just pick up whatever they see, right? So if you see a carpet that is mixed, geometric, monumental figures, and flora and fauna, that's a mishmash. That's just a fusion of many cultures. But Armenians also have a flora and fauna, but completely in a different form than what we see in Persian rugs. Here's another Henry, King Henry, standing on a rug. That little while ago when we talked about the 8 directions that represents the 8 rays, the 8 main rays of the sun. The same thing in an 8-pointed star form. Ambassadors, the same thing. And here is Madonna and Child. This is the very famous painting. Madonna, in this Renaissance painting, we see the pattern under her foot. It's the same one that that was used in many different forms of art in Armenian culture. This pattern right there under her foot is identical. I was going to bring this carpet with me today. Somehow I forgot. This one here is in my collection. It's the same identical carpet. This is dated 1888. And in here, we see the Queen Milke, again, under her foot. It's the same thing. Now, one is European, one is Armenian. The difference, almost identical as a subject matter when it comes to the carpet as a throne. There it is, that pattern we talked about. It was the same pattern that was also used in monasteries as a foundation. If you look at any Armenian historic churches, the floor plan, they're always, you see these 8 points, distinctly vivid. That 8-point or the 8 rays of the sun comes to us from way pre-Christian era that has its own philosophy. We cannot go today into that. But 8 is also, we have adopted in our language. 8 was the number of eternity, infinity. Now, you take any Armenian verb and put utyun as a suffix, it becomes eternal. Utyun is tied with 8 also. Now, the same concept, utyun as infinity, has traveled throughout Indo-European languages. In English, we say Asian, communication. But if you look at the word, we pronounce Asian, but it's actually, the root is utyun. Now, the suffix itself in English or in any Indo-European languages has no meaning. Action in French, action in Italian or Spanish, German, even Russian, atsya they call it. They put a atsya. It's the root of utyun. Only in Armenian language it makes sense, utyun, which ties into infinity. So 8, infinity, and all those symbols in Armenian rugs that represents the 8, it's the sign of infinite. Here is that's this rug right here to my right, the further right. That's the rug. These symbols, what are symbols? Actually, symbols are writings. They are letters and writings, testaments, before the existence of the alphabet. People always had the urge to communicate, to express their thoughts, to express and pass on to other generation the wisdom words that they had. So what was the best way of exposing that? Well, they did it in forms, in patterns. In this pattern, we clearly see what each element represents. Now, we have seen the swastika or the wheel of eternity on the 7,000-year-old piece of cloth that was found in Attic. If we look at this rug, this is from Khanzoresk region of Armenia. That's on your way to Artsakh. You pass through Goris region. Before you enter Artsakh, that's where a small village is, Khanzoresk. Khanzoresk people actually lived in caves up until 1950 something, early 1950s, until Stalin pulled them out and put them in dwellings in buildings. But they were very, very ancient people, and they stuck with their traditions, even from pre-Christian belief system. So right in the center of this swastika, you see a small square and a dot. As you see, I'm explaining that dot takes 4 elements, earth, wind, water, and fire, to start a life, or the existence of that seed. It can be a concept. It can be a beginning of anything. Seed represents a symbol of anything that can start a life. So the birth of a seed is the 4 elements. But for the seed to take life, to grow, it takes 8. Again, we see the 8. The 8, in this case, represented these S forms as dragons. So each element, earth, wind, water, and fire, has 2 opposite virtues, let's say, the positive and the negative. When the positive and the negatives are equally in harmony in all 4 elements, then the seed will sprout. It will grow. It will turn into a tree of life, and it will spread its wings. That's the message of this pattern, basically. This is one sample of what the patterns of Armenian rugs are. There are many others, but the core foundation of it is always, you see an 8 in there, and all these ancient pre-Christian belief system portrayed in those rugs. That we still have it until today. In major 4 holidays of Armenia is Diarın Tarach, the worship or the celebration of fire, Vartivar, the celebration of the water, etc. As time proceeded, as time became much more modern, and women started utilizing the Armenian alphabet to commemorate a work that they have, they started including inscriptions, such as this one. This rug is dated 1701, and the weaver is Gohar, and as you see what it says, I, Gohar, full of sin and weak of soul, with my newly learned hands wove this rug. Whosoever reads, say a word of mercy for me. In the year of 1149 was the Armenian calendar, and which is 1700s. Again, this is a perfect sample. She wove this rug and donated to the church, and this rug was on the floor church somewhere in Armenia, but currently is in a private collection somewhere in Texas. About Armenian rugs was not so well known in the West because of very obvious reasons. The last period where West, actually United States, started getting those rugs and using them was the late Victorian era, mid to late 1800s, when Armenian merchants actually started importing them to United States and presenting them. But during that time, since the only port city that came these rugs from were Turkey, they were known as Turkish rugs. Either they were Turkish or Persian. So the term Turkish rugs was used very loosely to identify those rugs until 1980s, when few people, few Armenians who knew better, they started protesting. Why wouldn't a carpet with Armenian writing would be labeled as Turkish? And there was a distinct difference between the Turkish rugs and the Armenian rugs. Hence, it was that time in 1980, about a handful people, including famous Garo Sassouni's son, Viken Sassouni, Lemyel Amirian, Jim Keshishian, and a few others, came together and formed an Armenian Rug Society. Armenian Rug Society started working since then, since 1980s. One of their main goals was to separate and identify and correct the names of those carpets so they could reclaim their cultural heritage. Otherwise, if a people loses its culture, they're not a nation anymore, just people. Any people would be identified and recognized by its culture. Without our culture, we're nothing, just people. So they have consulted German art historian, and this German art historian actually in 1976 was one of the first non-Armenian who differentiated the Armenian rugs from non-Armenian. And he printed this book called Caucasian Rugs. In this book, he clearly states and separates the Armenian rugs from other Caucasian tribal rugs. So after Ulrich Schurman, Armenian Rug Society has published this book, which is called Weavers, Merchants, and Kings in Texas. And in several museums, there was a whole collection of Armenian inscribed rugs that went into museums, and it continued its work. So this was the first catalog. This catalog was the second major catalog. In 1998, there was a 3-month exhibit and publication of this catalog in San Francisco. And then another German historian, art historian, that was researching Islamic art, actually, not about carpets. By doing so, for about 23 years, he was doing his research on Islamic art. And he says in this book that he was looking for, that this is a quotation, he was looking for a needle in a wrong haystack. So the result of his work, this huge, about 800 pages book, describes the carpet weaving tradition as being Armenian. Volkmar Ganshorn published this book in mid-1980s. Last year, Armenian Rug Society was honored to take him to Armenia. He has planted a tree with his own hand. He was given an honor medal, and soon after, about 3 months after his return, at the age of 98, Volkmar Ganshorn passed away. Armenian Rug Society also printed several maps identifying each rug of each region. Now, why would you say, why would an Armenian rug would be different from one region to another, to another, to another? Well, as we said, Armenian rugs iconography is actually a testament. They are saying something. So they must, in Armenian language, actually there are about 270 dialects. Each region has its own dialect, and each region has its own way of expression. Hence, you see a sign that symbolizes a sun might be a little different than different region. Hence, those huge variety, the wealth of these different patterns. But basically, they would say the same thing in a different, quote-unquote, dialect. Now, we cannot just concentrate on those patterns in Armenian carpets. These patterns has been expressed in many, many other forms. We see Wheel of Eternities in monumental art, in small badges, in logos. You see it all over the place. In traditional Armenian costumes also had those symbols on them. Now, sometimes we look at those books which portray the costumes of women dresses, and each region had its own distinct different styles. Again, what we are looking at, the same language in a different dialect. And I believe that at one time, when people, women were not really allowed to talk to foreigners, they would wear those beautiful costumes with those patterns, and if somebody has seen them, they would read as if this costume was her identification card, let's say. The same manner of, let's say, military costume. They put all these symbols on them. It means something. You look at a military man, you look how many ribbons, how many stars. It says there what ranking they belong to. It was the same thing in Armenian women's costumes. They would say, oh, she is from Mush, but she came as a bride to Van. She's married to such and such dynasty. She has 3 children. It all would be symbolized. So that tradition actually, unfortunately, has disappeared since we were uprooted from our native lands. Now, for the past 100 years, in 2 different places of Armenian people, let's say Western Armenia and Eastern Armenia, was actually a disaster. In Soviet Armenia, everything was Sovietized. All 16 countries that fell under communism, under Soviet, there was this huge work and attempt to have this one people of just homogeneous culture. Everything in Eastern Armenia that was quote-unquote national, that represented the Armenian national identity, was somewhat laid low. It wasn't encouraged. Least to say it was, even forbidden. Therefore, the Armenian carpet weaving tradition from villages was actually forbidden. The Soviets opened these factories. They called it High Gork. They brought all these weavers from villages. They said, if you want to weave carpet, these are the carpets you're going to weave. We're going to give you the sketches, this color. You don't have the freedom of expression, basically. You cannot weave just anything you want, as it was in the traditional form. You can only weave this color, this pattern, this size. That's it. For 100 years almost, the Armenian carpet weaving tradition has declined. Well, in Western Armenia, obviously, after the Hamidian massacres, we had these mass migrations. Then came 1915 massacres, refugees, and all that time when people were uprooted from their native lands, they couldn't practice their national culture. Basically, again, it was a dying trade. So this 100 years, nothing happened. But I did announce that I will be bringing some samples that you will see. After our talk, after our Q&A, you will see some samples here of the works of Armenian women and girls who, in refugee camps, they worked, they did embroideries, they wove carpets so they can earn their living in a dignified manner. Nearest Relief did a big assistance to that effort, and Nearest Relief opened some shops here in Europe to sell those refugee camp weavings. You will see some samples here. What happened in former Soviet Armenia, this group of people, they restarted the tradition of Gharapag or archaic carpet weaving tradition. So for the past 20, 25 years, there's this major effort to give a rebirth to the Armenian carpet weaving tradition. Aside from the Gharapag carpet and other factory, Magarian carpet from New York has actually obtained a factory in Armenia, the High Gork factory, and they are producing some nice carpets there. What will happen if we don't reclaim our own heritage? Last week there was this article that I'm sure you all have read about Azerbaijan, what they are doing in historical Armenian lands, namely in Nakhichevan. Well, anything that belongs to the Armenian culture, they are basically destroying it. We have monuments that are millennia old being destroyed, literally. And whatever they can destroy, whatever it is in their territory, they are destroying. Whatever is not in their territory, for example, these carpets, they are spending millions of dollars to claim it, appropriate it to themselves. And if we don't guard our heritage, our wealth, it will be gone. And as you see this report, they have destroyed all these khachkars. This was a monastery in Agulis. They have destroyed it. They have built a mosque there. So the report concluded, and here is where those khachkars were. Now it's a target field. They trained, supposedly. And here is another sample of a monastery being just destroyed, and a mosque there. Here's another one. Hold on to your questions. This is in Nakhichevan. Yeah. This is Akulis in Nakhichevan, historic Armenian village. And this is the report that, the data that just came out last week. How many, up until 1987, there were enumerated standing churches, 89 of them. From 89 until today, 0. Enumerated cross stones, 5,840 of them. Today, 0. Estimated of flanned tombstones, those are also monuments. 22,000 of them in Nakhichevan alone. Today, 0. So, who's going to claim these? Who's going to voice all these? Armenian Rock Society does its work by, in a limited way, whatever we can do. The Armenian Rock Society that I represent is just a small non-profit organization run by volunteers. Thanks to Ara Mgardichian, who has been helping me voluntarily. Stepan has been helping our newsletter and photography and all that, but this is run by strict volunteers. Armenian Rock Society has been also, about 6 years ago, we've been engaging in spreading the knowledge of Armenian carpet weaving tradition in rural villages of Armenia. And it's called an Adopt a Loom initiative. It costs about $50 to build a loom. With all the materials expense is about $50. A child, elementary school child, can learn how to weave a carpet. Hopefully we'll have a renaissance in Armenia. These are our children, our students in Armenia that weave, that learn the weaving in various rural villages of Armenia. So this is what Armenian Rock Society does. And we also do publications, exhibits. We give talks like today, whatever we can, and spread the knowledge. We are currently seeking volunteers to join us. If any student would like to learn more and in writing articles, in studying more, you're more than welcome. If after our presentation, if you can approach me or Ara Mgardichian, we can exchange our contact information and we can go forward. We can enlighten you more. Now, you can go visit armenianrocksociety.org. There is so much information there. That website itself is just like an encyclopedia of Armenian weaving tradition. You might have all the answers of the questions you might have. If you don't have a question, there is a form. You can submit questions. We'll be gladly answering you. Now, if you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer. Apparently, I covered everything. Yes, Aline.
I actually wrote some on it, so I gotta find.
Oh.
Okay. So when you were talking about them collecting Kermes in Armenia after fall.
Yeah.
You know the region.
The Araratian, well, mostly in Araratian Plateau, the Araratian Tash that they call it.
And that's in Armenia?
That's in Armenia, but it's illegal now because the Vortangarmir was going instinct, and they have closed the area for the Vortangarmir to come alive again. Basically, it was diminishing. It was going extinct. But it's illegal. There is only guided tours for children in a limited space for educational purpose. Yeah.
Earlier, when you were showing that first textile.
Yes. Arctic.
Not buzzard, but the one with the swastikas in it. And
Yes, the Arctic.
Yeah. It looked like there were round things there. They look like buttons. Or are they
No, holes.
They're holes.
Holes, yeah.
Really?
Yeah. The image is very much enlarged.
Symmetrical.
Yeah, they're holes, not buttons. Yeah. This is actually in Medzamor Museum right now, that piece. Yeah. Yes, sir.
My name is Kevork Alajian. I'm the professor at Pasadena City College. Thank you, first of all, for doing this wonderful presentation.
For your information, I may add this. Before Armenia's last independence, in 1988, I have lectured the same subject in Montebello High School. From 1990 until 1999, I have lectured the same subject in CSUN, in Armenian Studies. Unfortunately, there is only a couple of us that's doing this, and we have such a limited time to do all that you're saying. That's why I'm reaching out to you. If we can have volunteers, if instead of me going into all these schools, if I can have 2 of your students, 3 of your students sit down, have few meetings, they can do the same thing.
Very simple. This is what I'm going to say. Your lecture is going to be one of our topics to discuss in class.
Thank you.
Can you tell us about the website again?
Armenian Rugs Society. Just the way it's written. .org, .net, .com, it's all the same. I'll give you my card. I'll give you all that information.
This is what I'm going to reach out to you. Anybody who wanted to do their paper in regards of the museum, that's what you guys can do it, and let's talk about it in class. I would like to include that in our paper. So please go on the website, and you can include part of the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. By the way, one more thing let me add. You folks, you are reading books today. Prior to the alphabet, there were no books. People would read these carpets. These carpets are books, used to be books. And the history is written here. That's the only way our history has survived from pre-Christian era until now. Only in these carpets, and I may add, Gomidas Vartabet did a tremendous work. Our history was also written in our oral tradition, which came to us from our Armenian folk songs. See, it's oral or it's written. Nowhere else you will find the pre-Christian Armenian history except here. Thank you for coming. You had a question, I'm sorry.
Okay, I know in the old days they used natural dyes for carpets. Now, I don't know, is it still used from natural dyes? I doubt it now, maybe more chemicals.
Yeah, let me brief you on that. Thank you for your patience. In 1872, a German scientist invented actually a pigmentation that derived from petroleum. It is known as aniline, A-N-I-L-I-N-E. And since then, that aniline dye has been integrated into the mass production of fabric dyes and all that. But aniline dyes will fade. It will not withstand the natural dyes of the traditional Armenian rugs. You see all these rugs, some of them are 150-year-old, and the colors are still the same as it was woven at that time. Similarly speaking to the Armenian illuminated manuscripts, you look at the colors of what, 800-year-old manuscript, you look at the color as it was drawn yesterday. Natural dyes, natural derivative pigments are unmatched, unparalleled. They use it. We are reintroducing it. We are encouraging it. Again, hopefully we'll revive it in Armenia. Yes. Yes. I encourage you to ask questions. Please do. What was the question about Gomidas? That's what I heard. You didn't hear. Well, what I was saying is our pre-Christian history. When I say our history, I mean people's history, okay? We have Armenian history written in books. They're the history of kings and queens and wars and saints and all that. That was written by clergymen. What about the regular people? The people who worked in the fields, the carpenters, the shoemakers, whatever. What about those people? There's nothing about them except in our oral tradition, oral history, which came to us through our folk songs. For example, in Gomidas went from village to village, recorded all that. In those lyrics of those songs, he found the real history of Armenian people. Okay? Now, that's different than Armenian government or kings. We didn't know how people lived. We didn't know that Armenian wedding took place 7 days. Each day there was a different ceremony. We learned all that from our folk songs, from the lyrics of our folk songs. But there are other wisdoms that are not recorded except in those carpets. And if we learn this alphabet, as you've seen the sample of how the seed will take the 4 elements to grow, to become a tree of life. Well, that's an alphabet. There are those symbols say something. If we can only decipher those symbols, this is where our history is written, that we don't know anywhere else. It's not recorded anywhere else. That's what Gomidas came into play. Actually, Gomidas is my hero, my only Armenian saint that I know of. Yeah. Yes. 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 Well, you know, I have a whole different lecture on that subject. Shah Abbas, 16th century. When Mongols were going to invade Armenia, Shah Abbas brought all the cream of the crop, all the Armenian artisans, craftsmen, to Iran. That's where the beginning of the famous Persian carpet. We can go on and on that. That's a different subject. I have a whole file. But we are time limited. We have to conclude. Yeah, it is true. Yeah, yeah. Oh, I have been studying for 4 years, believe me. A little more than that. But it goes on. Yeah. Thank you, thank you, thank you.